So we have Joshua Dodds from the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. He's going to be talking with us today. However, he got in touch with me yesterday afternoon and said that his 1-year-old is very sick, and he realized he would be spending today in doctor's appointments. So we recorded his interview yesterday afternoon. So I'm going to play that recording for you today. All right, so now we're recording. Hi, this is Holly Bellabono. I'm with
Hi.
HMV, and which is Adult and Continuing Education on Martha's Vineyard. I am very pleased to be talking today with Joshua Dodds. We're going to be discussing race, diversity, and oppression, and many of the really pertinent topics that have been happening across the country in this incredible year of 2020. So super pleased to have you here, Josh. Would
Thank
you
you.
give us a bit of background about yourself, what you do for a living, where you're at, where you've come from?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. This is such a great honor to be here, to be able to present and to speak. So thank you so much. Again, my name is Joshua Dodds. I am currently serving as the Assistant Director of Student Engagement and Leadership at UMass Amherst, as well as Adjunct Professor through the ACE program in Fitchburg State. And right now, I am sort of just doing a lot of speaking and teaching around DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion topics. Previously served as the director of diversity and inclusion at Anna Maria College in Worcester, and I live in Springfield with my wife and my 3 sons, and I'm just looking to spread as much knowledge as I can.
Thank you. So you are a wonderful person to think about these topics, diversity, race, equity, oppression. The classes that you've been teaching deal with these subjects. We have you on board with ACE to teach this various topic through Fitchburg State University. We're excited about that. So what inspired you to go into this type of work with diversity work and education?
I've sort of been entrenched in this work for about 10 years now, dating back to my undergraduate years. Just very intense and into the work serving. I also attended UMass Amherst as an undergrad and just working in the Center for Student Development there. I just got really entrenched in student groups and student orgs, and a lot of my work sort of pushed me towards working with like cultural organizations and political and advocacy organizations directly as a student leader. And from there, just sort of took a life of its own. I went on to graduate and get my master's in higher education administration from Northeastern University in Boston. And from there, I transitioned a little bit because I've been working with children with mild to severe disabilities for about 5 years since before then, and transitioned there right after grad school. I worked as a dean of students at a middle school, and then from there, about 8 or 9 months later, I got my first job as the director of diversity and inclusion at Anna Maria College, and that's really sort of where the passion for me and things started to ramp up in these topics. And really kind of driving home some of the things that I had grew up learning and some of the things that I've seen and really taken a hold of, what I'm really passionate about and what I really wanted to do. And that was diversity work and working in that and amplifying voices, validating stories of the, Black and Brown and other marginalized communities and making sure those were out at the forefront. And that really sort of has, there was no direct incident that really got me into the work, except I do remember one time in undergrad I was assisting with an event, and this was with a Greek letter organization, the Kappas, and there was at the close of the event, um, what these Greek letter organizations do in this culture, it's called stepping or strolling, and at the end of the party, which was ended at 2 a.m. typical party that happens on campus and stuff like that. 2 a.m. ending, trying to get everybody out and get home safely. A lot of the Greek letter organizations that were there as well began, stepping and strolling on the way out. One of the things that happened was we had a group of officers that were working the event who had not worked this event before or any events like them. And what ended up happening was it got really aggressive The police who were not familiar with the culture or the culture at UMass really got very aggressive, and they started forcibly putting hands on students, pushing them out of the ballroom, and when they got outside, they actually took like the dogs out of the cars and really kind of frightening students. And this is me in undergrad, and I was able to help get the situation under control as I was working as a student leader and stuff like that with my supervisor. But that was something that I had witnessed sort of firsthand, and that was on Saturday. And Monday came around, and when Monday came around, I had some of my friends who were in the organization. They're like, "Hey, listen, we need you to come to this meeting because you were there, sort of helping us and leading us, trying to get this situation cleared up." And I'm thinking, like, you know, me, I was like, "You want me to go?" I was like, "I mean, yeah, I didn't think about it." And I was like, "Well, yeah, there was some wrong." They had a meeting with the vice chancellor, the police, and some other people who were really in positions of leadership. So they brought me in and asked me like, "Hey, well, what is your perspective on the situation?" I was like, "Well, I was working the event and helping the students and helping my friends and stuff like that kind of get through this event. But what I had noticed was like I was like, well, the police here were new and they weren't trained. And it was like what needs to happen is there needs to be better training for our officers to understand this culture because they weren't being disrespectful. They were on their way out. They were doing what they do. It's a culture. It's something that you have to know about, that you have to learn. And if you don't know, you're going to come in thinking it's disrespectful when they're really just doing these things. And you guys sick police on them, and sick the police dogs on them and everything. And I was like, it was a very terrifying situation for a lot of the students whom were primarily black and brown students who were there. And I was like, if you don't understand the culture, you're not going to understand this. And I was like, and you can understand how that comes off with the history of black people and police. That's going to come off aggressive and that's going to come off scary. So there needs to be some training and it needs to be happening. So that particular incident was kind of where I kind of got my feet wet and like really sitting at those tables and advocating for these population of students. And that was me as a student. And that's always sort of stuck with me as like the beginning point of all of this, where I started to learn more, started to take these things seriously, and really sort of understand, what it means to be an advocate and what it means to fight for things concerning diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that happened when I was an undergrad. And since then, I've sort of, just continued to learn, continued to grow, and that has really led me here today.
So speaking of the police and the recent protests all across the country and the issues that have led to a number of people and organizations saying, perhaps the police have too much jurisdiction, perhaps they're given too large of a budget, not enough training, as you said, and so there's been a widespread movement called Defund the Police or even Abolish the Police. What do you think about that?
So my thoughts are when we're talking about defunding the police, what we're saying is, and what people are trying to say, and some of the language you can argue is language that should have been used in the first place, but only for people who don't understand. Because when we're talking about anything concerning police brutality and things that are concerning in this country, you run into a lot of fragility, you run into a lot of sensitivity. So anything that someone says, they'll take as a literal stance. And because it's being taken literally, you have to understand, like, we're not actually saying defund the police as in we're going to take money from the police, we're going to fire all these officers, we're going to do this and that, and there's going to be no cops on the street, and people are just going to be running rampant. That's not what they mean. Defund the police means reallocation of funds. And what we say by reallocation of funds, we mean if a police department brings in $1 to $4 billion worth of revenue, taking 1 or 2 billion of that and reallocating it into the community, reallocating it among the police departments for better training, more practical training, more diversity training, things to help them understand the culture in these communities and stuff like that. Hiring mental health advocates to help respond to certain calls that come in with the police, because not everything requires police intervention. Some things can require, professional and medical help from mental health advocates and things like that, and really moving the needle and putting some of those funds into what they need. That's what it really means. It doesn't mean defund as in we're trying to fire cops and we're trying to do all these things. Now, some people do mean when they say abolish, they want to tear down the whole system. And which is understandable too, because we have to understand the history of the police, because the police really stemmed from slave patrollers. And we understand that the first inaction of police were slave patrollers, so they were automatically, it's automatically built into systemic oppression. And what people don't understand is that there are a lot of things in our country that are founded on issues of systemic oppression and racism and bigotry, and that's an ugly thing to face. But what we want to do is we want to look at these things, we want to face them head on, and we want to make sure that we're discussing these things openly and ways to change them and reform them so that we don't go back to what we used to go back to and what we used to do and revert to those things. And I think that's very important. And when we're talking about, reallocation of police funds or reforming, how policing is done, that's what we're talking about, because we have noticed with every level of killing, of police killings and different things like that, especially during this pandemic, where we've been able to see some pretty high cases happen between when everybody was forced to stay at home, between when everybody was able to go back out. There were, 3 high profile things with Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd. And we noticed with each and every one, information came out later. There was some instance of police brutality. And even when it came to George Floyd, I think George Floyd resonated with people more for a couple of reasons. And one, I believe that because everybody was home and we really couldn't go out at the time. Like some people were starting to go out and sort of maybe do some stuff and figure it out, but everybody was still pretty much home, not doing much because we didn't really know what's going on with the pandemic. But 2, George Floyd wasn't killed by a bullet. And I think versus what we Americans have become so desensitized to these killings, especially Black Americans, where it becomes a recycling of trauma. We've been so desensitized to these things and that things that have been happening that it's unfortunate, and it becomes a norm. It becomes a norm that, okay, another person was shot by the cops on camera. Okay, we see it. We're doing this and that. We have to understand that before cameras and all these things happen, we had to take word for it. Back when my parents were growing up, I don't know how many countless murders and things that have happened that we just took our word for it as people just dying regularly, even though we know that these were, pretty much heinous acts. And my parents grew up before, my parents were born before the Civil Rights Bill had been passed and signed. So like they've experienced these things and they have memories of these things happening before that was even intact. So just imagine before we had cameras, what was going on. But because we have cameras and racism is now getting filmed and police brutality is getting filmed and people are still seeing no justice, that's the big part. People are still not seeing justice portrayed out, regardless of whether it's filmed or not. We recycle these things because it's necessary. We're sharing these things reluctantly when it comes to killings and shootings, because we know that people need to see it so we can get things done and people understand what's wrong. But even with that, you're finding instances where police are still not being held accountable. And I think that's the important piece about that is, accountability and reallocating some of those funds for better training, so people aren't so quick to pull their guns out and shoot. They're pulling their tasers out, or just even de-escalation of situations. I think the biggest piece that has happened is that there's been a high level of non-de-escalation when it comes to Black and brown bodies. And there's evidence that there is de-escalation with people who are white, and they're on camera, and we can see that you're using these tactics here with this person, but this person's not offered a tactic. And we're not talking about just unarmed people. When we're talking about these things, even if we're talking about a Black person who is armed, de-escalate the situation, take them in, and give them the due process. We don't have to die. Even if they are wrong, they don't need to be killed, is what the point is. It doesn't matter if majority of these things have been happening on camera to unarmed citizens. But even those who have been armed, unless it's very necessary, which we have seen that every instance is not, take them in and allow them to face due process, because that's what they tell us to do, right? They tell, the police, let the investigation happen, let due process happen, right? But the problem is that that's not being offered to this certain segment of the population. So that's why people are upset.
So you work on a lot of campus, you're involved with a lot of campus organizations and students, so young adults. What sort of feedback are you hearing and seeing from young adults throughout this whole year, and their reactions to the news, their reactions to defund the police, to changing the system, to bettering the community? What sort of feedback are you getting?
Well, they're upset, and this younger generation of incoming students, especially those who are able to vote now and registered, and this is their opportunity for change. They're seeing these things in real time, and they're upset. And I believe that the things that have happened over the last few months have resonated more with the younger population who are saying enough is enough. And I'm 32, so I believe I still fall into that population somewhat, but I'm still, in my 30s now. So what I was doing to fight these things in my late 20s, I'm still doing in my 30s. But my students or students that I work with, they're tired of seeing it. They're tired of having to continuously fight for the same things. And one of the big things for me is like, I'm raising three, beautiful Black boys. I have a 6-year-old, a 4-year-old, and a 1-year-old. And even during this pandemic, I made sure that we were safe and that we were good. But me and my wife, we went out. My wife and I, we went out and we protested. We went out once things happened with George Floyd. We went out there and we risked our lives and we risked the safety and did things. And we found, we stayed in the back because we do have kids at home, and you never know really what's going on at these protests. And you hear about the violence breaking out that has nothing to do with people who are peacefully protesting, but you hear about these things and then the coronavirus. But the reason why I take pride into doing that and why it's important to me particularly is because when my boys are 32, I don't want them out walking and marching and protesting for the same exact things that I was doing at 32, and the same exact things that my father and my mother were doing at 32, and my grandmother and my grandfather who were doing things at 32. The history repeats itself when you don't learn. And we can see that a lot of things that are happening have been happening through history. We're talking about the Louisville riots in the 60s, the LA riots in the 90s. Everything has happened because of police brutality. And there's a form of police, like at some point, and within those riots, different things, because people are tired of how they're being treated by police. Like it's the cycles, they're repeating themselves. And the young students that I have, they're seeing this and they're like, okay, we need to get active, we need to do something. And what they're considered the Gen Z, right? And these are the students who people may consider radicalized or anything like that. But for me, I don't think it's radical to ask for a little bit of common human decency, some basic human rights and things like that. I don't believe that to be radical. I believe that to be people are just tired of seeing these things. And again, like I said, George Floyd on top of Breonna Taylor, on top of Ahmaud Arbery, all these things resonated, especially George Floyd, because George Floyd wasn't killed on camera by a bullet. He was killed by physical abuse that was unnecessary. And he died on camera. And he died on camera. And even when you get different angles, the police officer, I forget his name, but the police officer who initially had his knee on his neck, and then when they got a different angle, there were 3 other officers holding him down. So a lot of excessive force that wasn't necessary, and we watched a man die on camera. And if you haven't seen the footage, I don't recommend it at this point. But if you have, you know what I'm talking about. We all saw it, and that wasn't by a bullet. And I believe that that's why it resonates deeply with people, because man, this wasn't just a regular shooting that we all see and that we're so desensitized around. We're talking about somebody who was just killed by physical force at the hands of police that was unnecessary. We talk about Ahmaud Arbery, where essentially you have civilians taking matters into their own hands of an unarmed Black man. You have, no knock warrants, police coming in, not answering who they are, just regular plain clothes, shooting at people in the Breonna Taylor case, and then covering a lot of that stuff up about what happened. There's, I think having so many instances happen back to back were really resonated a lot, especially with the younger generation, because all of us are home, not just me, not just our parents, but like students are home, from school. They're doing, they have to do remote learning, but everybody, you're consuming so much TV and news that you have nothing else to do. You're able to see these things. And I think that's really what's triggered this younger generation to really get out there and say, enough is enough. And I do believe it is different than the times that we have, been a part of before. And a lot of that has to do with the younger generation getting involved. It has to do with a lot of white ally involvement more than before. And I just believe that these are things, the reasons why. And these, especially even on campus, before we had shut down, we had people who were marching and protesting on campus for different things. We had an incident on campus where a Black man was profiled for carrying a bag on campus. Somebody called, and this gentleman turned out to be someone who I believe has a disability, but he's been on campus for, a number of years, over 10, and he carries this big duffel bag. He walks around. He was just profiled, by someone. Someone called it in. The police had to stop, and they did all this thing, and it became a big deal. And students were like, "Wow, that's not right." Faculty and staff is like, "That's not right." We've had instances that people have been protesting on campus and doing different things, before the pandemic. So I just believe that people are just ready, and these students are just ready for a change, and the younger generation is leading that charge.
So thinking about that, about the younger generation and the differences in perspectives given people's age and the culture that they grew up in and where they're at now, can you talk about the Black Lives Matter movement and its counterpart, the All Lives Matter movement, especially in terms of generational differences and where people are coming from?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the Black Lives Matter movement, especially within its message, which is the most important piece about this, because you can say different things about the organization that people have found out about, where money goes or what's happened or different things. All of those things need to be considered, and I don't fault anybody if they're just like, yeah, I don't really mess with the organization like that because of blah blah blah, what I've read, blah blah, whatever people's reasons are. But the movement within itself, the Black Lives Matter movement, the movement and the message is strictly about holding police accountable for brutality and abuse of power, and making sure that justice is served in the instances where they are not being held accountable. We need to hold the police accountable. It's about police brutality and holding people accountable for what they do behind the badge, because we all know that not every officer in these instances has been white. It's not, and what I tell people is like, it's not necessarily a white versus black kind of thing when it comes to policing. It's abuse of the badge versus the black community and the black and brown community. That's how I interpret it, and what I tell people and students alike, because not everybody in any of these instances has, they all haven't been black. I mean, haven't been white. Some of them have been black. Some of them have been Latino or other marginalized communities. They come from afar, but it's about the abuse of power and the lack of accountability within that. And when All Lives Matter, the All Lives Matter movement comes in and sort of came about, it was because people didn't want to understand the message, and people refused to hear what this was about and the root behind it. Because we're not saying that Black Lives Matter more than anybody else's. What people are saying is Black Lives Matter too, as well. This is what we're talking about. When it comes to police brutality and holding people accountable, we know that there is a large gap between what that means and the accountability here. We understand that. And what people, they lack the empathy to understand what the message is behind this, because they're so offended by someone saying Black Lives Matter because they think they're being excluded. So because they think they're being excluded, which I don't understand anybody who wants to be included in police brutality, but because they feel so excluded, All Lives Matter became a thing, and it has nothing to do with that. And because we understand that all lives matter, but we also understand that Black Lives Matter was created because their lives don't seem to matter, and that's where the correlation is and the confusion is, because people are so sensitive. And it's not, you don't have to hate police to say Black Lives Matter. That's not what it is. But you want police accountability for the abuse of power, for the brutality that's exhibited. There needs to be something that's held accountable, because we've seen countless and countless and countless of times that police have been at the hands of these deaths of unarmed people, and even some who are armed, but just not using the proper training, the proper restraint, the proper de-escalation skills. And that's what this is about. This is strictly about accountability for police brutality and bigotry and systemic oppression and racism. And that's hard for people to understand, because they don't believe that it exists, because they live in their own bubble or they have their own experiences. And this isn't just across, this isn't just white people doing this. There are people of color and Black and brown communities who also are in the All Lives Matter movement, because they just refuse to understand or empathize with the experiences of others. And because your experience is different from someone else's, doesn't invalidate the experience of others. You can talk to many Black people who have had experiences with police officers, Black and brown folks, and even other marginalized communities who have had experiences with police officers that have been unpleasant. I've had them that have been unpleasant. And these things happen and they're real. And I think it's important to really make sure that those voices are heard and those stories are amplified, because people really do live in a bubble and they think because it hasn't happened to them, it's not actually happening, or it's not as extreme as one would think, or hey, police brutality and racism isn't the main issue that's plaguing the Black community. It's this and that. It's whatever excuses they come up with to try to invalidate racism, bigotry, and systemic oppression. Whatever they believe is the most important thing, or whatever statistics say the most important thing is, to try to move away from the conversation, is really where we're at. And even, All Lives Matter, Back the Blue, nobody's not supporting police. I know for me, I'm a strong proponent about this message: police accountability for brutality, for systemic racism and oppression, for implicit bias, all of those things that need to really happen. And one of the major things like about this is like, I have family members who are retired officers. My grandfather's a retired detective. Both of my godmothers are retired officers. I have a stepbrother who currently serves on the Springfield Police Department. I had one of my best friends is currently an officer in the Springfield Police Department. I have friends and acquaintances who are officers. These are not, it's not a matter of hating the police or wanting to get rid of the police, but we need to have accountability for those who are doing their job, because policing and there's certain just occupations that you're like, well, there are bad apples everywhere. Well, when it comes to lethal force and things like that, we have to make sure that we're just not accepting where there are bad apples everywhere. Policing is one of them.
You have
Think
to have
about
a
a
higher
pilot.
standard.
Right. Think of a pilot. You're not going to say, well, there's some bad apples in every profession when you got pilots crashing planes with people on them. We're not going to accept that, right? That's not something where we're accepting, well, this is the bad apple. No, when lives are at stake, you can't afford to have as many bad apples as there has been. You can't afford to have that kind of corruption. So when you, like I said, think about pilots. Like, you're not going to, nobody's going to accept that, this pilot has a record of crashing planes or crashing a simulation. You're going to put him with 100 people on a plane. That's not going to happen. We're not going to allow that. Why are we allowing that in policing? And when it comes to All Lives Matter, you got to think about that too. Like think about the infomercials that they have for saving the whales, right? So imagine something comes up and then there's a counter ad that says, well, all animals matter, so we're going to care about the cheetahs, or we're going to care about this, or when we're talking about that sounds foolish, because you have to put it in a different perspective for people to understand when we're talking about all lives matter, but this, and this. We're not going to do that when people are saying, hey, it's breast cancer awareness month. It was like, well, autism awareness month matters, all months matter, so we're going to celebrate this while you celebrate breast cancer. Nobody's going to do that. Pancreatic cancer, matters as well. That's like, nobody's going to do that when it comes to lives and things like that. So when you're doing those things, why are we allowing it here? Why do people have selective understanding with this particular subject, but not with others? So I think if people just continue to move past their own fragility and their own privilege, and really understand, take a look in the mirror about what people are trying to convey in the message, then we can continue to move on. And you've seen, different companies, and like Ben and Jerry's is a good one. Nike's a good company. Even, the NFL, when Colin Kaepernick was taking a knee in 2016 to combat this very thing about how sensitive people got in sports and doing different things. And even, the President of the United States, saying those SOBs off the field when people were kneeling in solidarity against police brutality and systemic racism and oppression, trying to understand that, and then come around this time when all these things happen back to back, and then you have, oh, we should have listened. Oh, we get it now. We understand what you're trying to say. You're not saying that, white lives don't matter. You're just saying that Black lives matter too, and they deserve the same kind of treatment and the same kind of benefit of the doubt, all of these things. And, so I believe that people have come around more, but you still will find a lot of people who just say, Black lives matter, this and that, and, they don't get it, but it's only because they refuse to understand. And I believe that once people really just take a look in the mirror and have some empathy for people, even if you can't, understand what they've gone through, you can empathize. And once you kind of just really do that and understand what we're doing, we can really get past your own feelings and understand what the message is about.
I totally agree. Similarly, so I'm thinking about in the context of Black lives, Black careers, Black advancement. For instance, I was on a website earlier today, the Massachusetts Commission on the Status of Women, and they have a big announcement on their front page of their website that this past summer, I think, they voted in their very first African-American woman president for the commission, which in a way is wonderful because people get to see, okay, that, it's finally happening. People are starting to break these glass ceilings. But in another way, it's like, well, why make a mention that she's African-American? She's a person who has made this achievement. And there's a question there, should that be noted? Is it a good thing for our young people to see this is the first time it's happening, yay? Or should it just be part of your acceptance and understanding that this happens? Black people get these positions, Asian people get these positions, Latino people and you shouldn't make a big deal of it. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so I'd have to disagree. And the reason why I have to disagree with, the idea of just not mentioning it at all is because um it's a reflection, and it shows, as much progress as we've made, we still have a long way to go. When we're talking about things that have been in place for decades and decades, some things even centuries, and you're having the first Black person hold this position, or the first Latino person, or the first Asian person, or the first woman, hold this person, the first openly gay person hold this position. When those examples need to be set, because people have never seen themselves in these certain positions. And most of it is long overdue. And I think it's important for people to understand that, yes, we've come a long way, but we still have far to go. When we're in 2020 and you're announcing, the first Black woman to run this organization, or you're hearing about the first woman in Major League Baseball to hold a general manager position ever, or the first Black man or the first Black person, period, to get appointed to a certain level of clergy within Catholicism that just recently happened, and things that have been around for centuries. So Catholicism is a religion that's been around for centuries. So and you still in America, this is the first Black person to hold a position like that. That's significant, and I think it needs to be celebrated. And it needs to, and people need to know, because, like I said, it shows how far we've come. And I recently heard an interview where Kanye West said something like that, like we shouldn't celebrate Black people getting in. It should just be celebrating Americans or just people. But the fact of the matter is that if Black people or different marginalized communities had access to these things, we wouldn't have to announce it, and we wouldn't have to celebrate it so much and breaking a barrier, because these things should have already happened. It shouldn't matter, but it does, because they shouldn't be the first.
No, totally. What was your experience with kids on the campus, college students, with Kamala Harris being elected vice president-elect? Was it the same thing? Was it finally, this is wonderful, or was it exasperation, like it's just now, like I can't believe it's just now, should have happened long ago?
It's a little bit of both. I think working with some of the cultural orgs and some of the political advocacy orgs, it's a little bit of both. Like, this is great, this is happening, but man, this took forever. I know there's a meme or a TikTok, but it's a viral video that's going around that lists all of the vice presidents that have ever, since the United States was enacted, and they happened, and had all been old white men. So it's just, old white men after old white man. Then all of a sudden you have this woman of color, who's young woman of color, who's here. And I think it matters, because that's not something that people thought was a position that would ever change. Right. Just like, when Barack Obama was enacted as the first Black president, that was something that people took to heart, especially the first time around, because there's Black people who never thought a day in their life that they would ever see a Black man in the office. And regardless of whether he's 50% white, he identifies as black, and his identity is black. And that's what he identifies as. That's who he is. That's what his skin color shows. And nobody thought that they would ever see the day that that would happen. And, I always hear that people joke about, being the first black president. Those were jokes that were passed down. You see them in comedy. Dave Chappelle had done a big skit about him being a black president in like 2004, 2005. And those are just things that were just not on the radar, that nobody ever thought they would see, because that hasn't been it. That just wasn't it. And so it's important to like, you can't just not celebrate those things, because they should have been happening. And then also it's a barrier broken. That means that the door is open, that somebody else can do it. Somebody else's, daughter can take that position. And then at some point, when we have the first woman president, that'll be another barrier broken, where that'll be something that people can aspire to be, because it's possible. When you think things are impossible, because they haven't happened, or you've been blocked from those opportunities, or those doors just haven't been open. That's why we're here today. And I just don't believe that that's something to shy away from, until there's actual change. When it becomes the norm, we don't celebrate things that, or we don't emphasize things or celebrate them when they're the norm, because it's just a transition. But when they're not normal, when you've never had a black person, hold a particular position of power, or a woman, or somebody who identifies a different gender or sex, or religion, or anything else, and they've never held these positions, I think that matters. And it matters for people, because they know that they too, who identify with this person, can aspire to be this. And because they think that they'll have to be the first, or they think that it'll just be impossible to break into. But now people can identify with someone in whatever particular field, and they can aspire to be that as well. And I think that's very important to celebrate. And until, like I said, until it becomes normalized to have everybody represented, then we shouldn't stop saying this is the first black, this is the first woman, this is the first Asian American, this is the first Latino person. Like, we shouldn't, until those things are normalized, then we just need to continue to talk about it and celebrate it as much as possible.
I would like to keep on asking you questions and continuing the conversation, but I think we've hit our time limit. But I wanted to say thank you, Joshua. This was it was an inspiring conversation, and your perspective is wonderful. And I'm very glad that you were willing and able to participate in our event today. And I want to thank you very much for your time.
Absolutely. I truly appreciate it. This is an honor for me. And I truly appreciate being tapped for this. And thank you so much for having me. And thank you all for watching and listening to what I had to say in my perspective. And if anybody ever wants to reach out to me, they can find me on LinkedIn, Josh Dodds. They can shoot me an email. It's jdoddснeu@gmail.com. I'm always available to talk, to chat, and just to hear everybody out. I'm always here. And again, this has been an honor. So thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you. Take care, Josh.
All right.
I think that we covered a lot with him that was very interesting and especially relevant to the Vineyard and our experience this past summer. Does anybody want to jump in and make a comment? One thing that I was thinking about while he was talking about this very last point about celebrating the achievement of reaching a certain level or status by a minority or by someone who's never achieved that before. I keep looking back at my own childhood and watching Sesame Street. I grew up with Sesame Street, and it always strikes me as an adult now looking back how effortless they made it to see people of color interacting with white people, to see people of color having this job and that job, to see women in these roles. It just, looking back, I can't even remember if they were very open about it and talked about it, or if it was just the natural way that it was on Sesame Street. And it just made it seem like that's the natural way it should be in life to me. And then later, as a growing child and adolescent, when I saw something that differed from that, oppression or racism or discrimination, I was like, wait a minute, that's not right. That's not the natural way it is. Did anybody else grow up with Sesame Street?
Well, yeah, I was gonna say something similar in with Mr. Rogers, and how he had the I think it was like the mailman, he was black, and how he invited him in to take off his shoes and take a rest, and they shared the little kiddie pool, and they both had their feet in at the same time, and how big of a breakthrough that was. And I don't know, it's it should just be a normal thing, but it's just not. And it should be accepted around the United States and around the world. And it's interesting to look back and see things from the 80s and 90s and think oh, well, how far have we come? And it's yes, we've come far, but it's have we really come that far? I don't know if it was in Josh's speech or in his talk, or in when Reverend Mebane spoke, that he said, with this new with Joe Biden, president-elect, coming in and going, hopefully things go back to how they were a little bit before. But it's there was always racism, even when Obama was president. And it's more now there's just a platform, because of Trump and his whatever, there is a platform for the racists to come out and be louder. And it's just those people are just going to kind of retreat and hide again for another 4 years until, I mean, I don't imagine Joe Biden running again in 4 years, but what do I know? But it's waiting for another person similar to Trump, or Trump running again, or, stuff like that. So it's then in 4 years, then we have to deal with this again. And the racism is just going to be subdued for a short amount of time and then to come back. It's driving around the Vineyard, you still see all the Biden-Harris signs, very excited, very happy. And the people who were Trumpers have taken their signs away. So now they're going back into hiding. And it's just this perpetual cycle that needs to end. And it's figuring out, it's creating white allies, it's all of that. And I don't know.
Yeah, I grew up in New York, and also around the New York City area, and also grew up with Sesame Street. And we had I mean, I was in a fairly liberal area, and it was fairly mixed. And I honestly, this was a wake-up call for a lot of the white people like me who kind of thought that is this really still a problem, when Trump was reelected, when Trump was elected in the first place. But my fiance, who's black, he was just yeah, I could have told you that was going to happen,
Yeah.
So
Julie has a
Vanderhook
question. Yeah.
I just wanted to just, I love these conversations, and I just want us all to be able to continue holding these conversations when we're outside, so that it's not just coming from minority people.
Yeah.
That we're actually bringing other, if we don't have minorities at our tables, then why? And then, really look for people to bring into this circle, or step out of your circle to go. It's just, these are wonderful conversations that we should be having every day to get people back on track. We're speaking about something, that is so important, and it shouldn't be in just that realm of what we see on public television, or what we were raised with, what we try to tell our children every day. We have to live it as adults. Adults have the convenience of building gates and walls and boundaries around ourselves and living in a bubble. And these are important things that we should not do. We should reach across these lines and help people be recognized and be part of these conversations. And it is about these uncomfortable conversations.
Yeah.
Right. Well, and that's where white allyship truly comes into play. And that's that's a term that's relatively new to me. And I grew up in a suburb outside of Detroit, a very, very diverse town. And I feel very, very fortunate of that. But it's still white allyship was this new new term for me. I don't know if it's like, obviously it's not a new concept, but it's just like, I don't know. I think, maybe in the future we can have a conversation or like a workshop on what that actually means and how to actually be a white ally. How to be a good white ally as opposed to like greenwashing it or whitewashing it, if you will. And it's, like where you say you're going to do something, they don't actually do anything. It's like, what is that actually? And it's like prolonging this conversation of, what you're saying, Julie. It's like, it's really involving the community, especially on Martha's Vineyard, where, we are diverse, but it is very much a white community with little pockets of diversity. And that's wonderful. And it's like, how can it, be bigger, I guess.
Yeah.
Connie Board has a
Connie?
question.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Can you unmute yourself?
I think that we're seeing, you called it, what did you call it?
White allyship.
White
ally.
And I've been calling it intersectionality because I noticed that in the feminist movement is very much turning to the Black population because for years and years, it was a white woman's movement. It was a middle-class white woman's movement. And that has changed radically. And I think we have to embrace moments like this. The other thing is, I noticed that in Black Lives Matter marches, even though I live in France, we still have a lot of politics going on there, and democratic politics especially, that I'm involved in. There are many white people marching in Black Lives Move. You probably saw that. I would bet it's 50-50. So somewhere there is this rapprochement taking place where people are coming together and not seeing each other themselves, whether they're Black or white, but seeing themselves what they can accomplish and what their beliefs are. And if you truly believe in real integration, then it shouldn't only be Black people talking about integration. It should be a joint movement. And I see that happening more and more in literature, in gender studies, in what we read. So I'm quite hopeful right now about this possibility of people coming together, not on their for racial reasons, but for reasons that go deeper into society. Now, what kind of a reaction is that going to have on racists? Because we know now with Donald Trump that there are a lot of racists. Is that going to force people to dig their heels in more? On every social movement that you have, it's always 2 steps forward, but then there's always 1 step backward. And we just lived through 4 years of 1 step backwards, where the worst of our beliefs and emotions were brought to the foreground. But nonetheless, I think we are going in this direction.
I want to speak to Jenny's point, like just being an ally, I think is most important nowadays. And so I look at it like, even if you may you may not even recognize or even know the background of anyone as, of who's standing next to you. But if you are in a room, this bright color or, people's beliefs, and you see something that is injustice, actually speaking up and being an ally for that person in the room. And even if you may not agree, but just say, okay, I understand your point, then they know that they have the support, especially in corporate. So I'm from UMass Amherst. Actually, I never met Todd before. It was interesting that we work on the same campus, and I'm in a leadership role as well. But at the same time, it's just interesting to know that someone within my community, the UMass Amherst community, is looking into this. I actually attend multiple meetings with Mass Mutual, just listening in and to the changes that they made within their corporation regarding social justice. So this platform today has been, very intriguing, and I have learned a lot. I was working in the background, but I also was listening because I really wanted to learn something. To be able just to not even bring it to myself, but bring it back to my team as well and have a discussion about it, because it's a lot. It's not about like, it's what's not being said. It's not what's being said. It's what's not being said. And we may hear the same things over and over. And we may see the same faces, and we may, seem the same people say it. But like, if we see different people saying the same thing and we're coming together, then, like Josh said, we wouldn't have to have our children relive something that we have to live today, unfortunately, and that there's so many individuals who have died, and there may be more coming who may have to die due to, social injustice. But however, what are we doing within our community to make it a different place? Small changes. I have a 18-year-old son, and he's going off to college. I don't know what's gonna happen, what community he's gonna be in, what college he's gonna get accepted to. However, I have to teach him things that maybe his neighbor, wouldn't have to teach their kid, because we're different, we look different, and so we're going to be treated different. And I try to let my son be aware of that. And so it's tough conversations, but it needs to be had. Like, whether we realize it or not, it happens every day where people are profiled, even down to just disability, and I think that changing in leadership with presidency is helpful, because when you talk about just people with disabilities, children are, if you raise your children a certain way, you'll teach them, like, if you see somebody that looks different, they may not have their arm, but they have other insights. They're just like you. They're just missing one item, and you are too. You're missing something that's maybe not be visible, maybe invisible. But actually teaching the foundations of that within your household, and then letting them spread it out, because it starts at home. Like, we're not born and saying, hey, we don't like this color, or we don't like this type of person. It's a learned behavior, and I think Josh pointed that out too. It's definitely a learned behavior. So what can we do today to try to reteach our children? Maybe not just pushing it to the communities of when they're getting older, but actually embedding this into like education would be important for people to know that their neighbor, may look different, but they, they have a lot of qualities to bring into the world, and letting it be known at a young age, because those years when you're talking about kindergarten to fourth grade is intense. And if you're teaching it at that level, and parents are engaging at that level, as we engage them in coming to musicals, as we engage them with coming to, I don't know, like a festive for the holidays, engage them into social justice at an early age, so they understand, hey, it doesn't matter your community. You can live in I live in a predominantly, white area. And it doesn't matter. Like, it should be taught. It's not taught, it's not. And so when we get to like the one time of the year, the Black History Month, when we think about, oh yeah, let's celebrate Black history. And the first year that, my daughter went to school, they actually watched Roots. I actually never really watched the whole movie of Roots, but like, my kindergarten was watching Roots, and she didn't know anything, so she's laughing. She didn't understand, And so these are the things, like understanding when is the right timing to show certain things, and getting them involved in those types of things. I don't know. It's more to the story than just pushing it to adults. It has to start at a younger age. So that's all I have to share today.
Thank you.
Thank you. And part of that is kind of why I brought up Sesame Street earlier, because it was the same thing. Like, if this, you're not getting it in the schools, I wasn't getting it in the schools. I got it partly at home from parents who had mixed perspectives, but were mostly more open-minded than they may have been. And then from TV shows like Sesame Street. But you're right, it's a taught perspective. And my fear is that once you're older, you can't unlearn it. We've gone over about 15 minutes, which is great. It makes me believe that we should reconvene at another time, that we'll reorganize another time to have a dialogue on that topic and these topics. But I do want to take a very short break before we welcome our final lecturer for the day, Julie Vanderhoop. And Julie, you're on the call with us, right? You're here? You're still here?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, so we recorded Julie's talk prior to this, so I was going to play the recording, and then Julie, do you want to be available for questions after?
Sure.
Okay, we'll do that then. So I'm going to mute my screen and come back in like 3 minutes just to give everybody a short break, and then we'll be right back with Julie Vanderhook.